Okay, so have you ever like completely frozen up trying to figure out the tip on a bill?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe you've gotten that, that look when you ask someone about what they do for a living and money comes up.
Right.
It's like this weird, awkward silence.
It's so uncomfortable.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, why is it that talking about money is such a like taboo topic?
Totally. It's like we're not supposed to talk about it, but
Yeah.
it's such a big part of our lives.
Huge, and it's not just about being polite. It goes deeper than that.
It really does. It's like this, I don't know, it's like this unspoken thing. We all have these weird hangups around money.
Yes. And that's exactly why I'm really excited for this deep dive today. You shared some excerpts from NW Money on Your Mind by Vicky Reynal.
Yes.
And wow, this book is really fascinating. It's like reading, like having someone read your mind about your finances.
Absolutely.
We're not just talking about budgeting or anything like that today. It's really about the psychology behind our money habits.
Yeah. And that's where it gets really interesting, I think, because there is a connection between our mental health and money.
Totally.
And the book really digs into this. And there's all this research that even shows that financial stress can lead to things like anxiety, depression, even physical things like ulcers or migraines.
It's true. It's like that whole mind-body connection thing.
Absolutely.
When you're stressed, you feel it physically, and when you're lying in bed at night worrying about bills, your body's really internalizing that.
Totally. It's not just in your head, it manifests physically.
It really does. Something else I thought was really interesting that the book talked about, it's not always about the amount of money someone has, it's really our experience with it, right?
Exactly. And you can see that in so many different ways, right? You have people who have a significant amount of wealth, but they're so anxious about managing it, or they feel guilty for having more than other people. And then you have people who are struggling financially, but maybe their anxiety comes from like this deep need for control or a fear of repeating their parents' mistakes.
Right, like I'm never going to be in that situation.
Exactly.
Yeah, very interesting. It's so personal, there's no one right way to look at it.
It really is.
And where does this all stem from? Ooh, like, where does this come from?
It often goes back to childhood.
Really?
And the book talks about this idea of money scripts, which I love.
Okay.
It's like this underlying code that we develop really early on that influences how we think about and interact with money. And we may not even realize it.
Wow. So you could have a parent who is really, I don't know, like really frugal.
Right.
And that could impact how you look at your own finances, even subconsciously.
Absolutely. And the book gives this great example of this woman, Paola. So Paola, she couldn't even let her husband buy her a movie ticket because of her upbringing. Her parents were very controlling with their money.
Wow.
And it instilled this like deep fear of being financially dependent on anyone,
Wow.
even later in life in a healthy marriage.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, so then you have someone like Warren Buffett, right, who's obviously incredibly successful,
Right.
but he has what seems to be at least a healthy relationship with money.
Right.
So what creates those different outcomes?
Right. And it's fascinating because you see such a variety of money scripts. I mean, the book even talks about this woman, Hetty Green, who was considered to be one of the wealthiest women of her time. She lived incredibly frugally, almost to an extreme.
Really? So she had all the money but didn't want to spend it.
Exactly. And while everybody's story is different, it does show that there's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to money scripts.
Mm.
But just understanding that they exist can be really helpful in recognizing how they might be showing up in our own lives.
Absolutely. So let's talk about something I think a lot of people struggle with, and that is overspending.
Sure.
What are some of those underlying psychological drivers that make us, want to buy all the things?
Well, one of the biggest ones, and this is something the book talks about in detail, is this need to fit in.
Okay.
And they give this example of Helen, who was constantly overspending on clothes that she never wore.
I was just going to say she had a closet full of dresses. I'm guilty of this too.
Right.
Okay.
But it turned out that her overspending really stemmed from these deep-seated feelings of being an outsider during her childhood, and it was almost like she was trying to buy her way into feeling like she belonged.
Which makes me think about social media.
Oh, absolutely.
Because now it's like you're constantly bombarded with images of perfect lives, perfect bodies, and expensive things.
And it's so easy to get caught up in that comparison game. And it's not just about, keeping up with the Joneses anymore. It's this like fear of missing out.
It's true. It's like this impossible standard, I think,
Totally.
that we're all trying to hold ourselves to. But what about the opposite? What about the people who underspend, even if they have the money to maybe enjoy themselves a little? What's the psychology there?
Well, the book makes this really important distinction that it's not about being cheap, it's really about understanding those underlying beliefs. A
Hmm.
lot of times it comes down to this feeling of unworthiness, like they don't deserve to spend money on themselves, even on things that they need.
Wow.
And the book gives this example of this guy, Flavio. And Flavio, he wouldn't even buy himself a winter coat, even though he had the money to do it, because he had this belief that he just didn't deserve to take care of himself.
It's like these things really do become self-fulfilling prophecies
Right,
sometimes.
exactly.
It's really sad, actually. The book also talks about how sometimes underspending can be about control, especially in relationships.
Absolutely, yeah. Holding on to money can be a way of feeling secure, especially if you've experienced maybe like instability in other areas of your life
Yeah.
or a lack of control.
Right. So it's like your security blanket almost.
Exactly,
Which
exactly.
makes me think about the idea of self-sabotage, because that's a whole other thing the book goes into, which is so interesting.
Oh, yeah.
It's like even when we know better, we do things that undermine our own, financial well-being.
Absolutely. And I think that's where really understanding the psychology behind it can be so helpful
Mm-hmm.
because, like, okay, well, why am I doing this if it's not actually in my best interest?
Mm-hmm.
And the book talks about this one guy, Caleb, who would overspend every time he got a raise or a bonus.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that he was subconsciously trying to punish himself for, like, surpassing his father's expectations.
Oh, wow. So he was holding himself back financially because of this, like,
Exactly.
subconscious belief he had. That's really powerful.
It's heavy stuff. And it's not always, parent related. Sometimes it's about, our values that we've inherited. The book also talks about, people feeling guilty about wealth because of maybe how they were raised or their religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's like you're battling all these internal messages about what's acceptable, even if you've created your own success.
Exactly, exactly.
It's a lot. And speaking of relationships, we can't forget how money can be a source of tension in even the healthiest partnerships.
Well, for sure. I mean, you're essentially merging two different financial languages.
Totally.
And if you don't do that carefully, it can be messy.
It can be a disaster. So what are some of the biggest things that, couples run into, those pitfalls?
I think one of the biggest ones, and the book really, really emphasizes this, is the danger of unspoken expectations. We just kind of assume our partners share our same money script without ever really talking about it.
Right, and that can cause so many problems.
Oh my gosh. Misunderstandings, arguments, resentment, all of that.
Yeah, the whole thing can just blow up.
Exactly, exactly. And then there's also this issue of power imbalances
Mhm.
where one partner might use finances as a way to control the other, whether that's conscious or unconscious.
Right, like limiting access to bank accounts or always criticizing how the other person spends.
Yes,
The book had some crazy stories about this, but I think even in situations where it doesn't get to that level, communication is still key, right?
communication is everything. I mean, it's like with any important aspect of a relationship, you have to be willing to talk about your needs and your fears and your goals, and money is no different.
Totally, totally. Okay, so we've talked about the individual and the kind of interpersonal aspects of this, but I'm also curious about the role of secrecy. Why we keep money secrets and what impact that has, because that's fascinating to me.
Oh, absolutely. And the book makes a really good point here about differentiating between privacy and secrecy. Privacy is healthy. Secrecy, on the other hand, usually comes from a place of shame or guilt or this, like fear of judgment.
So, like, hiding a shopping bag from your partner
Right, exactly.
is one thing, but it could be a symptom of something much bigger.
Exactly. And the book gives this really interesting example of this woman, Ellie, who inherited a large sum of money and kept it a secret from her husband because she was so scared of losing her financial independence.
Wow. So it's not even always about hiding something bad. It's more about, like, protecting yourself, maybe.
Exactly, like a self-preservation thing. And it's interesting because the book ties this into cognitive dissonance, which is basically when our actions and our beliefs don't align.
Oh, interesting.
So in Ellie's case, like part of her might believe in being totally open with her husband, but then another part of her is terrified of what that vulnerability could mean.
Totally, totally. And those conflicting beliefs can cause us to act out in all sorts of ways.
Absolutely. The book even talks about how small acts of dishonesty, like let's say taking credit for a purchase that maybe your parents helped you with, can create this internal conflict that can really eat away at you.
Oh, totally. It's like, oh, what a tangled web we weave. But what about stealing?
How
Because I feel like that's a whole other, conversation when it comes to the psychology of money.
it really is. And while the book goes into different types of theft, shoplifting, fraud, there often is a psychological component to it.
Yeah. The story that got me was the one about the celebrity chef who got caught shoplifting groceries. And it's like, this is a guy who can clearly afford it. So on the surface, it's like, what is going on?
Right, and I think that's what makes these stories so compelling, because it's like, okay, it's not always so black and white. And it turned out that he had a really traumatic childhood, marked by like loss and abuse and neglect, and his shoplifting, even as a successful adult, was almost a way of like acting out some of those unresolved issues.
Wow, so it really speaks to how deep-seated some of these patterns are.
Right.
And how they don't always show up in ways we might expect.
Exactly, exactly. And, while we can't condone harmful behavior, I do think it's important to understand those underlying reasons so that it can be addressed. And I think on that note, it's really important to touch upon financial abuse, because that's a whole other often hidden aspect of this that can be really damaging, especially in relationships.
For sure, for sure. What are some red flags to look out for there?
The book talks about things like limiting a partner's access to funds, making them justify every purchase, or using money to instill fear or guilt.
Wow.
It's about power and control.
Totally. And it often goes hand in hand with other forms of abuse.
Absolutely.
Which makes it that much harder to break free from.
Yeah.
Really scary.
It's really serious, and the book really stresses the importance of recognizing those signs early on and seeking help if you need it, or if you know someone who's experiencing this.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about some kind of, I don't know, like heavy stuff.
Right.
But I do want to touch on generosity, because I think that's an important part of our relationship with money too.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because even generosity, which we associate with positive emotions, can be surprisingly complicated.
Totally.
Like even generosity can be driven by different things.
Like, yeah, the story in the book about the mom who showered her daughter with gifts, but it turned out that she had this deep-seated fear of abandonment.
Exactly.
Which is so sad, and I know we've all kind of experienced that in different ways.
Right, and sometimes it can even be used, like generosity can be used as a form of control. Like you see this with parents and their adult children sometimes.
Oh, totally. It's like the strings attached.
Exactly.
Literally.
It's nuanced. The book even talks about toxic generosity, where giving is actually used to like manipulate or punish or create a sense of obligation.
Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished.
Right.
But really, it sounds like it's about being aware of our motivations, for sure.
100%. Being honest with ourselves and, setting healthy boundaries so that it can be a positive experience.
For everyone involved.
Absolutely.
It's true. It's so easy to kind of fall into that trap of thinking everyone else is coming from our own like internal script without realizing everyone's got their own baggage.
It's like that saying, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about.
That's so true.
And that is so true with money. But the good news is, once we start to unpack these patterns and understand them, we can actually make more conscious choices.
Yeah.
And the book ends on a really empowering note. It encourages people to take action.
Okay, so where do we even begin? After this, someone's listening, they're like, okay, well, this has been fascinating, but now what?
Well, the book talks about a couple of things. One is starting a money journal, not just to track your spending, but to really track your emotions around money.
Oh, interesting.
Like, when do you notice yourself getting triggered to overspend? When do you feel that guilt or anxiety come up around investing?
It's like shining a light on those patterns, right?
Exactly. Once you see it, you can start to shift it.
Totally.
And I think sometimes those patterns are so ingrained that, it's not always something you can just do on your own. And the book even talks about the value of working with a therapist, maybe even a financial coach.
You like a financial therapist almost.
Totally, totally. And for people in relationships, this might be a really good place to start having those open and honest conversations that we've been talking about.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
I mean, it can be so helpful to have that neutral third party mediating those conversations, especially if money has been a source of tension in the past.
Totally. So we covered a lot of ground today. We talked about money scripts, the psychology of overspending, underspending, the impact of our childhoods, relationships, secrecy. Even generosity. I mean, it's pretty clear our relationship with money is way more than just what's, in our bank accounts.
Yeah, it's so much deeper than that. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I hope listeners get from this deep dive is that our financial lives are just so deeply intertwined with our emotional well-being. And I think just understanding that connection can be so, so empowering.
For sure. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this question. It's the same one that the book asks. Thinking back on everything that we discussed, all the stories, all these insights, what is one money habit you have that you now see a little bit differently?
Ooh, that is a good question.
Right.
And it could be anything.
Totally.
It could be big or small.
It could be something small. Maybe it's, oh, I need to make that budget I've been putting off. Or maybe I need to have a conversation with my partner. Whatever it is, hopefully this deep dive has given you some things to think about and some tools and insights to create a healthier, happier relationship with money.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on this deep dive with me. It's been quite a journey.
This was so fascinating. I love talking about this stuff.
Me too. It's so interesting. Until next time.